running your logically you're flawed. Your thought process is not sane, and it's not sound, and that's going to cause problems later on in how the law what the law will look like in the long run. Which is why this is a very, very important maxim. All five obviously universal maxims are extremely important, but this one here is where the general logic or mantiq, which is what scholars Islamically not only learned but they taught. And if you go to Azhar, for example, or where I studied, في Syria, learning one of the texts of mantiq, Sulam al-Munawraq, for example, or Isa Ghuji, to study mantiq is a part of your Islamic development. You have to learn how to think logically about things. And I found that since that ever since that was removed from the curriculums, or ever since the emphasis on that was kind of downplayed in the Islamic curriculums, that we ended up with products that people who were produced by Islamic institutions who never studied this, who are saying things that make absolutely no sense at all. Like they say statements, and for the common person who's never studied Islam, it sounds like it makes sense, but it doesn't make sense to anyone who studies Islam appropriately, because they're making statements that are contradicting. The statement is contradicting itself. Like the statement is when you say, I don't follow the madhahib, I follow Quran and Sunnah. What are you talking about? Like, that is the stupidest thing I've ever heard in the entirety of my life. Like that makes no sense at all. What are you saying? What did Abu Hanifa follow? Was he taking from the Torah and Injil? Where was he bringing his rulings? It was from Quran and Sunnah. What about Malik? You know Sunnah more than Malik. You know. I'm not necessarily a Maliki, but I'm going to claim that I understand the Sunnah more than Imam Malik himself, who wrote the Muwatta, the first book that was ever recorded, and he lived in Medina. What are you talking about? How does this make any sense? These statements are flashy. They sound nice. They sound really attractive but they are not meaningful. In essence, they don't mean anything. And the only reason someone is able to say it is because they don't understand how to think. They don't have the thought process. These scholars knew the Quran, knew the Sunnah. The reason they have rulings that you don't agree with is because you just don't understand yet their methodology of thinking, what maxims they apply to these different situations, differently than maybe what another scholar applied to it. And this is just the methodology of how we're supposed to look at Islam. So really, some statements that are made, they lack basic basic rationale, and it comes from the fact that sometimes we don't necessarily fully understand what we're talking about. Yeah. Mantiq is logic. Yeah, mantiq is the science of logic in general. All right, and then all these other wordings they're just there for your personal ability to kind of read them and be familiar with these different wordings. All right, so the origin of the maxim. So the verses in the Quran that talk about suspicion and certainty, such as, for example, إِنَّ الظَّنَّ لَا يُغْنِي مِنَ الْحَقِّ شَيْئًا. Indeed, having a probability or presuming something does not change reality, does not change that which you know is haqq. And this Quran is absolutely filled with verses that differentiate between that which is haqq, which is certain, with his yaqeen, which is ilm, actual knowledge, and that which is not, which we have a probability or we have some degree of doubt in. They're not equal. They don't work the same way. Another example are the many ahadith, and like I told you, these maxims are not generated from one thought or one hadith or one ayah. They're generated from the totality of what the Quran and Sunnah are talking about. And the scholars are basically taking the summary or the bottom line of what the Quran is teaching and turning them into principles, little principles that a jurist and an usuli can use later on when they are faced with real life scenarios and problems that don't have textbook answers in the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ or in the Quran. Sometimes you have textbook answers, so it's easy. You just kind of refer to the Quran, but sometimes you don't. Many times, actually most of the time you don't. Most of the time you don't. You have to have a methodology how you're going to deal with it. And that's why faqih needs these things. So prophetic teachings that show the Prophet's way of dealing with doubt in this face of certainty. He did this all the time, alayhi salatu wasalam. He would always teach the Sahaba how to deal with when they are certain of something, when they're not certain of something, and how to kind of balance these things out. There are many examples of that. The consensus of scholars, meaning this maxim is agreed upon amongst all scholars, those of them who wrote on this topic. I mean, those of them who actually authored books on the subject of legal maxims, and those who didn't. It's used equally by all of them. You'll find this maxim written as it is in books of fiqh that had no interest of actually explaining legal maxims, because it's something that is agreed upon among scholars of all of the madhahib and outside of the madhahib as well. And of course, reason is another, just basic reason and logic. Certainty is not equal to suspicion. And that's just that's a maxim of life. That's a maxim of logic. If certainty equals suspicion, then nothing makes sense anymore. Like certain statements are, when we say maxims, a maxim is something that is not up for debate, because if we have to prove it, then we're not going to be able to speak the same language anymore. Like you have to have a number of principles that are self-evident in order for me to use those self-evident principles to argue other things. Okay? So if I don't have them, then and I have to prove them, يعني ولا يستقيم في الأفهام شيء إذا احتاج الشمس إلى دليله. Meaning, there's no way for us to reason or think or speak if I have to bring evidence on the existence of the sun as I point to it. If I have to prove to you that the sun is there, well, when we're both looking, then we're not going to be able to reason here, because that's, what do you mean? What exactly are you asking me, and how are we going to do this? So this is something that Muslim scholars have always known, that you have to have a number of maxims. I am giving you the maxims of fiqh, right? Not the maxims of science, for example, or everything. These are maxims of legal law and legal rulings. Obviously, some of them are going to be maxims of logic and of life as well, and this one is a very good example of that. So definitions. There are 4 definitions that are important that the usuliyun use that you have to know the difference between. So the word yaqeen. So know these words in Arabic and in English, so that you can always refer to them when you listen to them recited or used in different contexts. So the word yaqeen is certainty. The word dhann is probability or high probability, either or. Something is probable. Possible is somewhere at the 50%. That's possible in English language, even the definitions that you find in Merriam-Webster. Possible is somewhere in the middle. Probable, meaning it's more than that. It's somewhere in the 60-70. High probable is somewhere that as well. So you can say dhann is high probability or probability. Both are correct. I don't think I'm not trying to get too technical, but both of them are correct. Shak is doubt, or you could say possibility. You could say possibility if you understand that the definition for shak is a 50-50. In Arabic, when you say shak, that means you have no reason to believe that option 1 is more likely than option 2, or option 2 is more likely than option 1. I have no reason, I have no way to know which one is more likely. Then that's called shak. I'm sitting here, I have 2 options, I don't know which one. I'm not sure. I just don't know which one it is. One probability is where I think it's most likely that. It's most likely that. So for the sake of this maxim, sometimes dhann and shak are going to be treated as one, and sometimes we're going to distinguish them from one another. And I'll show you the examples of that as we move along. We'll come to that, inshallah. And again, we're talking about dhann, which is not assumption. So that is assumption, right? When I have dhann, I'm assuming something in them. So that's where it's them. But dhann here is in probability. We're talking numbers. This is like math. Yaqeen 100%. Dhann 60-70%. Shak 50-50. Wahm or illusion is where it's less than 50. Where I'm not sure. Like I don't know. I think that the probability of this thing is less than 50%. It's called wahm or it's called illusion. Yes. Not really. I mean, some scholars will make certain arguments for that when they explain, but they don't have to. It's a takalluf la hajata lah. Meaning they out of the lack of need. Meaning they're looking at the verse itself, and instead of trying to explain a certain point, they just say this here is equal to certainty, and they move on with it. But not really. No. Dhann, when as soon as the Quran is used, and you can. I know the examples you're pointing out to, and I may share them with you later on here. May not. But no, it's not. And then again, the Quranic. Remember that the Quranic wordings for things are going to be governed by the contexts in many cases. All right, so context here matters. So the example the brother gave me in the Ba'd al-Dhanni, dhann here is the context of assumptions, meaning I am assuming something in you, and that's it. Obviously, there's some relation because I don't know about you this thing. I am assuming, meaning I have a probability to think it, but still here we're not talking about probability in general is ithm, is sinful. No, we're talking about assuming things, bad things in people. So in the Quran, the words that we use here and the usage in the Quran won't always be exactly the same because the usage of words in the Quran are governed by the context of the verses that we're reciting. Here we're getting a little bit more technical in terms of fiqh and usul al-fiqh. So these are the four terms, just know them, that you have yaqeen, 100%, dhann, 60, 70, 80, anything that's not 100. Anything that's less than 100 in Islam is going to be seen as dhann. You can have dhannun ghalib, high probability, which is like 90%, then you have dhann, that is make 65, 70%. And then shak is right dead in the middle, where you actually have no qarina. You have no supporting evidence that tells you that either of these options is more likely. And then wahm is where the likelihood is less than 50%. It's more likely the opposite. It's more likely the opposite. It's called wahm or illusion. Or you have no evidence at all, is another way of looking at it. So what are applications of al-yaqeen la yazulu bil-shak? There are many applications. So all chapters of jurisprudence, no exception. Every chapter of jurisprudence, you're going to find this law or this maxim being applied. For sure, and we're going to take examples of that as we kind of move along, so I'm not going to give you examples specifically, but generally speaking, where you're talking about tahara or salah or zakah or hajj or janaiz or siyam Ramadan or muamalat or uqubat or hudud or whatever else, all of it, you'll find that yaqeen la yazulu bil-shak is actually the most. I actually, the way I should have worded this differently, it's not that it's in every chapter of jurisprudence, because all of the five universal are technically in every chapter of jurisprudence. It has the highest frequency of being used in every chapter of jurisprudence amongst all of them. In terms of where the first one that we talked about is there for each and every situation. There's no scenario where the intention is not going to be judged and used and have some impact on things. But outside of that first one, this one has the highest frequency of actually leading to a ruling. Al-umuru bi-maqasidiha will not always lead to a ruling. It always has impact. Sometimes the impact is in akhirah, but the impact is always there. There's not one situation where it won't be there. But the maxim that has the most impact on rulings is probably this one. I would kind of vote yaqeen la yazulu, has the most impact on rulings in dunya for sure. And then matters of theology. You're going to find it in aqeedah a lot. Actually, you can't understand aqeedah at all. Like our theology is not comprehensible without this maxim being applied to it. Because when you hear the Prophet ﷺ say things or describe Allah, or you read descriptions about Allah in the Quran that don't offer us certainty of knowledge, offer us probability of indication, because it's what he's saying here could be understood this way or that way. Then you always go back to what we have certainty with. لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ شَيْءٍ. Nothing is ever similar to him. Nothing. That does not require any form of interpretation. It is certainty in terms of, this is certainty. I know this for sure. So anything else that is I'm told about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, I just hold it to this certainty. And then if it fits it, then I keep it. If not, I interpret it in a way that keeps it. So this is in theology, it's used very heavily. Without it in theology, Islamic aqeedah would have been derailed long time ago. Like long time ago. Islam wouldn't even be here anymore. But because of the fact that we have this maxim in our deen, where once something is clear, khalas, then there's no debate on it in terms of the certainty of its authenticity and the certainty of its indication, you don't ever lose that for something that is dhann. That is probable. He could mean this. It seems like he's meaning that, but no. This one here is saying that it's impossible for that to be meant. So I understand this differently because I have to hold myself to that maxim, right? And it goes in a lot of So for example, Allah Subhanahu wa Taala wahid. That's certainty. So when he uses the royal we in the Quran all the time, nahnu khalaqnakum. So what? Am I going to argue whether there's one God or multiple gods? No. Nahnu is probable. There's more than one way to understand it. You can understand it as the royal we, where it's just myself and those whom I command and follow me, or there's more than one. No, you go back to what you're certain about. What are you certain about? Qul huwallahu ahad. You're certain about that. So that never changes. Does that make sense? So this is where this is used in theology, for example. Matters of origins of jurisprudence. Usul al-fiqh. So from this maxim, you have a source of evidence called istishab. Istishab is where you continue the continuity of a former situation. So if something was happening before, you just continue it going along. It's called istishab. Unless something comes and says you stop doing that, you continue moving forward. So for example, istishab is a source of evidence. Not all of the four schools of jurisprudence agree to it, but it's considered for at least two or three of the schools as a source of evidence. And it comes from this concept that whatever was, and we know for sure was, is not going to be removed by something that we're not sure whether it happened or not, whether it was said or not, whether it was changed or not. For example, what they use for this And we'll talk about istishab in its own section of talking about this maxim. For example, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us about certain animals that we can eat and others that we can't eat. But there's a bunch of animals that he never talked about. So what do we do with them? Istishab. What did the Arab do? What did the Arab do? So the Arab ate this, didn't eat that, eat this, and then we just continue that. That's called istishab. Because we know they did that. We have no evidence that anyone came and said you shouldn't do it anymore or change that. So we do istishab, we continue whatever the Arab were doing prior. So what the Quran said very clearly, this you don't eat, that you eat, that you don't eat, you do it. And this is obviously a way of looking at this topic. So istishab, that's what it means. It's the continuity of a previous situation, because we know for certainty that happened. We don't have certainty in the fact that something else happened. Yeah. Precedence would be a way of looking at it. It's in usul al-fiqh, I explain it a little bit in more depth in terms of defining it and where it's actually applied. I just want you to understand, like, that in origin of jurisprudence, you also use this. This maxim actually generated a source of evidence that the scholars use within their madhahib to give rulings on different topics. Matters of legality. So you're not like someone. There's no responsibility unless indicated. Like al-asl, the certainty is that you're not responsible unless the Quran comes and indicates that you're responsible for something. Like there's no accountability unless indicated there is accountability. So the asl is not that the yaqeen is not that you're responsible and accountable. No, the certainty is that you're not. You need something to come in and say that you're responsible and accountable, and that makes a huge difference in how we see people's roles and people's existence altogether. In usul al-fiqh, for example, another way that this maxim applies is that words are understood literally, unless there is a reason for us to understand them figuratively. Why? Because a word has a certain meaning, a meaning of certainty. I won't leave that meaning of certainty unless there's a reason for me to do so. Because I know that the word asad means a lion. I'm not going to leave that meaning unless there's a reason for me to leave it to something else. Or else, if I don't have that, and there are Islamic groups who don't have that, and they're called the Batiniyya, they explain the Quran however they want. Because they take a word that has a very clear meaning and say, that's not what it means. It means this. Why did we leave the literal meaning to some other figurative meaning? What's the reason? Why did you go from a meaning that is 100% to a meaning that is only 80% of the time? Like, for example, the word lion means the animal, but it can also be used to describe someone. Fulan asad, which no one's going to think that they're some form of mutant. They're going to think that this person is extremely brave, right? So the reason I would leave the meaning of lion is when there's a reason for me to, there has to be a qarina, something that is indicating that this is not the actual meaning for it. But if I don't, if the word has a literal meaning and I decide I'm not going to apply the literal meaning, I'm going to apply the figurative meaning just because I want to, then we have, and people do that. People take the Quran and they start explaining the Quran in ways that are absolutely absurd. Absurd. I had to, a part of my focus was tafsir and usul al-fiqh when I was in university, and I had to spend some time studying books of tafsir written by other Muslim sects. I had to read Tabatabai, and I did a couple of them, and some of them were, when I read them, it was absolutely insane. It was very, very weird to read that how is someone who understands Arabic even possibly saying these things? And it comes back to this, is that if you don't apply this rule, that you're not allowed to leave the certainty to something that is less certain without there being a good reason for it. You have to state, then you can end up messing up everything that Islam is doing. And so it's applicable to origin of jurisprudence. Same thing, commands are general unless there's a specifier. Like a command is going to be understood generally unless there's some reason for me to think it's specific, because the origin, the yaqeen, the certainty is that when Allah gives a command, it is for all. And that's the origin. A command for all, because the Quran is for everybody. That's the certainty. I'm not going to say that there's an exception here, or this is specific for this group, unless there is some supporting evidence that has the same degree of certainty that will derail the usage here. So, applications of this legal maxim goes not only into every chapter of fiqh, it goes into aqidah, it goes into usul al-fiqh, it goes into matters of legality, responsibility, and taklif, meaning for someone to be mukallaf. It covers everything. Which is why, and I'm going to be kind of tooting the horn of these universal maxims over the entirety of this course, because they are the 5 universal maxims, but the name kind of gives it away, that they cover everything. And I don't think a Muslim can actually afford not to know them. You don't have to have studied them in depth. If you're studying a course, I think it's important to, but at least to know what they are and what they mean, because if you have them, they can always go back to them when you're trying to deal with within an Islamic ruling of some sort, or if you're stuck in a situation where you're uncertain what the answer is. So some examples that we're going to go over. Loss of ablution. So here's some examples of where it's so a loss of ablution. If you are standing there and you're wondering if you lost your wudu or not, what are you certain of? You're certain of a wudu that happened 15 minutes ago. What are you uncertain of? Whether you let go gas or not, right? So what you're certain of is wudu. What you're uncertain of is not having wudu. You go with what you're certain of, right? If you're standing there wondering if you made wudu, right? If you're standing there wondering if you made wudu, it's the opposite. What you're certain of is the hadath, meaning you remember going to the bathroom or letting out. You remember that, but you don't remember if you made wudu or not. So you stick to what you're certain of. You're certain of losing your wudu, so you go and make it. Now the Maliki specifically have a different approach to this. I just put it out there because I'll talk about that at some point. Right? The reason we study these maxims is to see where some scholars had exemptions, like had some exceptions, or had an argument to explain why in this specific situation they think that maybe we should go in a different direction. And I'm going to share all that with you. But this is the general way of looking at it. That's why when someone is wondering, then you just go back. What are you certain of? What are you sure of? So debt, for example, owed by the deceased. If the debt, if someone passed away and they owe debt, and someone came and asked for the money, and someone else said, I think he paid it, or we don't. The asl is that he owes the debt, unless there is because what's known to people is that this person owed money, owed wealth. Unless there's evidence that money was paid, unless there's actual certain evidence, then that stays with dhimma. So if you give someone, that's why إِذَا تَدَيَنْتُمْ بِدَيْنٍ فَاكْتُبُوهُ, and there should be shuhud, there should be witnesses when you take the money, witnesses when you don't take it. Because if it becomes known that this person owes something, and they pass away, then that can be paid twice. So he paid it during his life, and the person who wants it can come and claim it again, and he'll get it because the asl, what the certainty is that he owed. But you don't. The doubt is that whether he paid it or not. There's doubt that whether he paid, unless there's certainty with it. Like even if there's one witness say, "I saw him pay it," it's not enough. You need the proper documentation that was paid, because the asl is that it's not paid. So, for example, loss or damage to a safe custody item. If someone is holding on to something, and this is in the form of a wadi'ah. I'm not talking about there being a company that you paid money and there's a contract written that any damage is they're liable. No, I'm talking about a wadi'ah. So if I give a brother something, hold on to me for, and it gets harmed, the asl is that he is ameen, that this person is trustworthy, and that he did not do anything to actually cause this harm, and that he is not liable for what happened to it. So it goes back, even in Muhammad, it goes back to that. What is the certainty? The certainty, or what we know for sure, is that this person is trustworthy because I gave him the wadi'ah. I put it in his hands, and I wouldn't have done that if I didn't have certainty that this person was trustworthy. So when it gets harmed, does that change the fact that he's trustworthy? The harm is the doubt, like whether he actually was liable is doubtful. So I stick to what I'm certain of. I'm certain of this person was worthy of carrying this safe custody, this item in safe custody, and that they are trustworthy. So I don't leave that for something else. Now, if you have a contract written with somebody saying that if something happens to it, safe custody, you're not paying the person. Just so I understand what I mean. Wadi'ah, I give you the item, and I'm not paying you for holding on to it. When I'm giving you money for it, and there's a contract where you're liable, that's a different story. Contracts change things when it's written. I'm talking about the general way of how this is going to be looked at in Islam. We always go back. What are we certain of? Remember the question I told you to ask last week or the week before when we were talking about al-umur bi-maqasidiha. The question was, what was the intention? Right? You have to ask that question. You absolutely have to ask that question. If you don't ask that question, whatever you talk about later on is completely worthless. You have to ask the question. And that even if the answer to that question does not necessarily affect the result, you still have to ask that question, and ask any questions that are there. Did you partner any other intentions? You have to ask those questions in order for you to start thinking about a ruling on something. You have to ask that. Here, the question is what do we know for sure? That's the question. What is certain? What is the certain piece here? And subhanAllah, it's interesting what these maxims actually force us to ask when we're looking at. When you see them, and when we're done the 5 universal minds with the questions you have to ask, you'll basically, you're not going to become a faqih, but you'll in a situation you'll have, if you take it. See, people who take masail to fuqaha, they don't, and I know immediately based on Like what the faqih is asking, whether he knows what he's doing or he doesn't. Because if the person who's telling the story, people tell stories in sometimes insane ways. They just tell stories and they don't cover all the, they don't put they don't fill the check boxes. They don't get them all right? Because they're just telling a story. The faqih's job is to ask the right questions in order to figure out how what you're telling me is going to affect the ruling or not. Because not every detail to your story is going to affect whether Islamically is going to be different or not. And I've had this problem before where people drag me into a room and talk to me for 45 minutes or an hour and 45 minutes and on and on and on. And I want to say, just what's the question? And then the question, wallahi al-azim, sometimes the question has nothing to do with the story. Nothing, wallahi, nothing to do with the story. This question was so technical. It was whether a divorce during a certain time was halal. Why did you tell me the story of your full marriage and everything that happened and all? I'll never ever be able to forget what you told me and the trauma that you left with me. How do I sleep tonight with all of this? Just ask the question. I'll ask, you tell me what you want to know, and then I'll ask you the questions that are relevant to the story that you're telling me, because I don't need to know everything about everything. I just need to know certain things. Like some people want to tell me something, I don't need to know that. You think that me knowing that is going to change something to the ruling. It's not. I'll tell you what I need to know. I need to know, first of all, the intention. Then I have to know then I have to figure out what is certain in this scenario. What do we know for sure? You have to know that. You have to figure out what is known for sure in any given situation in order for there to be any hope of you producing a ruling that has validity within Islamic law. So another example is the nafaqah of a wife. So the nafaqah of a wife, meaning what a man owes his wife outside of clothing, feeding and putting a roof above her head and taking care of the children, there's a nafaqah. He owes her, she's owed money for herself, usually between 8 to 10% of what he makes, if there's anything left of what he makes at the end of the month after doing all of that. So she's owed that, right? So if she says at the end of marriage that he never gave me nafaqah, right? It's what she says. Because what we know for sure is the nafaqah is thabita fi dhimmatihi. That the nafaqah is something that is owed by him. That's what we know for sure. I don't know if he gave it to her or not. There's no way. So if he, at the end of the marriage, says he never gave me nafaqah, he owes her the full nafaqah. Which is why when it comes to these things in marriage, it has to be agreed upon. There has to be some way to track these financials. So I've said this a million times in marriage. In marriage, financials have to be treated very strictly and very clearly. Before you get married and during marriage, the financials have to be clear. Because if you end up in a situation where you get a little bit unlucky or things don't work out, the financial will come back and cause you a lot of agony, a lot of pain. In dunya and then in akhirah as well, because if you're owed. So I always tell you just talk about the financials. What exactly, is it the default, the norm? Is it the default, or is there something else happening? Is she bringing her money? Is she putting her money in? How much is she putting in? How are you going to compensate her for the money that's being used here? How much are you making? How much does she have access to? Like, these are important questions to ask, because it makes a big difference. Because at the end of the marriage, what we know, if she said, you owe me all this nafaqah, how am I going to give a ruling? I have to ask myself, what am I certain of? What I'm certain of is that she is owed nafaqah. What I'm uncertain of is if she actually got any of it or not. I don't have, and unless the man can produce, here it is. Here's month by month. Because it's not hard, because men's like, it's impossible to calculate. No, it ain't. No, it ain't. It's not hard at all. It's actually really easy. It's really easy. How much do you make a year? I make 80,000. All right, what's 10% of that? 8,000. How many years do you make it for? 20 years? 8 times 20? There you go. That's what you owe. Musibah, wallahi. The musibah, he's bankrupt. Like it's a problem if he did not actually make sure that this was something that was covered. And again, I'm not here to talk about the fiqh aspect of this and the fiqh of marriage. I'm just trying to explain to you how things are looked at by jurists when they're talking about things. The prayer timings, for example. Prayer timings, I think. Do I talk about? No, I don't. So there's a good example. I can talk about 2 things here. So, if you are, for example, it's nighttime. It's nighttime. And I pray Fajr, right? I pray Fajr before it's time. Does it get counted? Does it count? Think about it a little bit. Does it count? Why? From this maxim. I'm not asking anything else. Just this maxim. Why? Sure. But why based on this maxim? If it's at nighttime and I pray Fajr and I found out that it didn't adhin yet, I'm telling you it doesn't count. What were you sure of? You didn't ask the question. What are you certain of? Nighttime. You're certain of nighttime. Were you certain of Fajr? You weren't. You're certain of nighttime. So that doesn't count. Does that make sense? The question is, what am I certain of? I'm certain of, that's why when you're doing Siyam, if someone eats right? And then they found out that it was after Fajr, their Siyam is fine. Why? Because what they were certain of was night. What they were uncertain of was Fajr. So they're fine. If someone eats before Maghrib, the opposite. Because what are you certain of? Day. You're uncertain of Maghrib, so you ate before time, you lost your Siyam. Do you understand the problem here? So it's all about the question of what am I certain of? I'm certain of what? Is the time of Dhuhr or time of Asr? Well, I'm certain this time of Dhuhr. I'm uncertain whether Asr came yet. So you can pray Dhuhr still. You have to wait until you're assured that it's Asr time. If for some reason you don't have a phone or you're not able to figure out what time Asr is. Does that make sense? So this is why, yeah.
What if you weren't supposed to be certain, like you assumed that, it's nighttime, but it's actually, you didn't look close enough to see that there is light outside. So you called it certainty, but somebody else would have said, no, it's not certain. You're eating and it's after.
No, you have to actually do your due diligence for this stuff. I'm not talking, you're sitting in a room with blinds down, you didn't just decided that it's to. Yeah, you have to at least try. Like you looked and it's unclear to me, and I Salat al-Fajr and found out it was like I didn't. Yeah, so when you try your best, you have to give yourself enough time to make sure that you're in a position of certainty. So people who don't have, that's why Fajr back in the day was not as accurate as it is today. They would pray a little bit later. You kind of pop a bubble for people. They pray a little bit later because they didn't always have access to know exactly when the first, because they didn't always be able to see it. Like Bilal would stand on the menorah and look. Sometimes there was clouds. Sometimes there was a mountain in his way. Sometimes he didn't see it. So he had to wait until he could see something and then he would perform Fajr. So they prayed it a little bit later. Not to say that I'm just saying that today we have access to technology that allows us to know things very, very accurately. They didn't have that back then. So they had to know these rules where they had to actually know what am I certain of and what am I still, and then I have to wait until I'm certain of something, then I can go ahead and do it. So there's a matter of just, but in our situation, it's more of, you didn't have access to a phone, or you thought there were still 10, 15 minutes because of something, and you ate and they found out that you were wrong. That situation, you're still fine. Your Siyam is still fine because there was a mistake that was made here, but you didn't necessarily, it wasn't based on negligence. We go back to the same thing. So you have to ask the question first, what was the intention here, right? So I didn't ask the first question, right? The first question was the intention. So the intention is, no, I'm doing my best. I'm not trying to eat out of space. I'm not hungry. I just want to find an excuse to make some food. Like, you have to, if the intention is wrong, then we've already kind of messed it up. But if the person is doing their due diligence and they just made an error, then you have to know what was certain, what was uncertain, right? And again, I'm just trying to help you understand. Number of rak'ahs, this is an easy one. So you're praying, and you're like, do I go up to the fourth, or this is the fourth? What are you certain that you prayed? You're certain that you prayed 3. You're uncertain whether you did the fourth or not. So you get up and do the fourth. Right? So that's why you always go by the least. We make it easy by saying go by the least number of rak'ahs, the lower number. It's really not going about the lower. That's not the rule. It's not go by the lower number of rak'ahs. It's go about what you're certain of. What are you certain of? I am certain I prayed 3 rak'ahs. For sure 3. I'm just not sure if I did a fourth or not. Good. There, you answered your own question. Then you stick. Then 3 is what you're certain of. Go from there. And then do sujood sahu at the end, and that's how we kind of do we judge these things. All right, another example: contracts are permissible unless there is an indication otherwise. This is so. In Islam, any contract that is any contract that we put together and any clause we add to the contract is permissible unless there's going to be. Why? Because the asl is ibaha fil contracts fil muamalat. The certainty we have is that any contract that we agree upon is permissible. That's what we have certainty with in Islam. There has to be a reason for me to say this specifically, or this clause specifically cannot be added. Which is why Abu Hanifa, for example, and many of the Shafi'is and most of the Hanbalis are happy with any clause being added to a marriage contract. Like, you can add clauses to it. You can say, well, the clauses, that's why the isma can be in the hand of the woman. And that's why there's certain things to be, that's why the financial agreements, I say, do it in the marriage contract, so that it's clear of what exactly the expectations are. So that love can actually flourish and thrive. You have to have those agreements. So you can add to the marriage contract a lot of details to make sure that we know what we're holding ourselves to up front, so that there's no lack of clarity. Just be careful when you do that, because if you add too many clauses to your marriage contract, the other person will stop marrying you. Just so you know, majority of people don't. The moment there's an extra contract, especially guys, will say, "Oh, I'm good. I don't want any." But we have enough contracts that we have to sign in our lives. Just be careful. But some contracts are needed. Some clauses are needed within contracts to make sure that there's clarity and that people are safe and taken care of. Adding conditions to contract, you can add any condition that you want. So contracts, any type of contract is permissible unless there's some reason otherwise, because al-yaqeen la yazulu bil-shakk. And you can add any clauses that you want and conditions as long as there's no reason not to. Ownership of an asset. Ownership of an asset. This is a nice mas'ala fil fiqh that I'm just adding here so you're understand. So if you're carrying something with you and you have it all the time, I am allowed within a contract, within a mu'amala, to assume that you own it. I'm allowed to assume that. And if it turns out that you didn't own it, it's on you, not on me. In Islam, if you are behaving as if something is yours, and I look at it and I assume, because al-asl, al-yaqeen, certainty, that a Muslim will carry and use something that he has ownership on. That's the asl, that's the yaqeen, that Muslims will do this. So it's more of a general certainty, that Muslims don't use things that aren't theirs. And another Muslim who sees that is allowed to assume that is the norm. So if you're carrying something, it's always with you, and I say, you want to sell that? And you do sell it, and it turns out not to be yours, the law actually will go after you. And because you made it seem as if it's yours, and that's the certainty that I was building upon, not the opposite. It's just an interesting mas'ala fil fiqh that actually takes away the blame from someone, because you say, well, I should have asked for the ownership. I know I shouldn't. I don't have to. If I don't need to do that within a Muslim community. So some exemptions here for this. Some exemptions to this rule, and just to kind of share with you where the scholars or where the usuliyun would have, it's not they would stop using this, it's where they would add an extra layer of safety, all right? So it's more, when I say exemptions, I'm not saying that this universal maxim that applies everywhere is going to be thrown in the garbage. No, we're just going to say there's an extra layer of safety that is required here for this to work appropriately. So for example, paying for a bought item that the buyer claims has an impactful flaw. So if I took something, so I'm going to pay for an item that I bought. Now, as the buyer, I claim that there's an impactful flaw in it. So I bring it back to the seller, and I say that there's an impactful flaw here. That meaning it's a flaw that's bad enough that I can't buy this anymore, and I owe the money because I bought it. We have certainty here that I bought this item. Right? So do I pay them? No, in this situation, I don't pay because of the fact that this may be an impactful flaw that will affect whether this transaction goes through or not. So I wait until there's a ruling on whether this item is going to come back to me, meaning the flaw is not impactful, or it's a flaw that I saw but I ignored it initially, or it's something that I caused. I mean, I'm liable for it because I actually took it in my hand. And if I do, then I'll pay at that point. And if it's actually a flaw, then it goes back to them. Why? Because they said here, the certainty is that my money is mine. They said the certainty is that my money is mine. So when I give it for me to give it to someone else, there has to be full clarity on what this is. That makes sense? So even though we have certainty that I bought this item, you can say the reason that we have this exemption is just because they had to look at what was certain with an extra layer, just for safety purposes, to make sure that people don't have mazalim, just people don't get cheated out of their money. So you could say that the certainty, and this is what scholars argued initially, is that this was bought. That means the money is owed, so I have to pay. But then they said, no, the asl is that your money is yours and cannot be removed from your custody unless the transaction is sound and fair. And in this situation, this transaction is being disputed on something that could impact whether it actually goes through or not. And that's why I put it as an exemption, just because it took an extra layer of looking at what is certain and what we consider to be certain. When it comes to money, it's a little bit more tricky, right? So, yeah.
Sorry, could we look at it as not necessarily an exception or exemption, but saying that the actual transaction is not valid to begin with because it had an improper...
We don't know that. See, we don't know if the transaction was invalid because of the flaw, because we don't know whether the flaw was there or not. We don't know if it's impactful or not. We don't know if the person who bought it actually inflicted it or not. So there's a bunch of questions here, and maybe or we don't know if the buyer saw it and just decided that he didn't care initially, and then decided that he cared later on. So there's a bunch of things that we have to ask. So there's a lot of doubt there. So we can't call this an invalid transaction. It's just a disputed transaction, where there's an impactful flaw that could make it invalid. That could make it invalid because he sold me something that was flawed, and he ghabanni. There was ghuban. I mean, he didn't show me the flaw, and I didn't have the access to it, and now I'm being so because there's a possibility of this being an invalid transaction and a possibility of my money being taken unlawfully by someone else. They applied this extra layer, right? And this is just, but the same idea. It's the certainty of what I own versus what I have to give. So that's where. Yeah, so once you have the money, we've completed the transaction. And now the dispute becomes a secondary issue. But when the money is still with me, the dispute is primary because the person who was bought from or the seller is waiting for their money. So it becomes a more primary issue. When I've already given the money, this dispute almost immediately becomes a secondary issue. It'll take forever for this dispute to come through. And if I am madloom, meaning if I bought something that was flawed and I paid for it, then that is an act of oppression or persecution against me. And the reason that they put it that way is to set up an extra layer of safety for people who are buying, so that their money is not taken away from them. Because technically, the asset is still there, and the money is still with me. Even though the buying already occurred. I mean, I bought it, we agreed to that. So technically, you can argue that you bought it, you should pay for it. But because we're disputing an impactful flaw, they said that the asl is that you keep your money with you until that is disputed. Yeah.
Only applies before the money is handed over from the buyer to the seller?
Yeah.
After that, it's just
After, it's a different story altogether. Yeah. After that, the whole argument becomes different in terms of what we're going to be doing and how we're going to approach this. That's why before that, yeah.
So this fall under the maxim, الشك يمنع ولا يرفع?
Yeah, الشك يمنع لا يرفع. Yeah, this falls under that one, and that's actually what they use to talk about this altogether. But which is another wording of اليقين. الشك يمنع لا يرفع is actually one of the generated maxims by this, and we'll talk about it inshallah. It's going to come up. Yeah. Doubts regarding rukhsas. So a rukhsa is a ruling of alleviation, and Islam has something within our law where you will be given a ruling to alleviate certain rituals or remove certain responsibilities from yourself. For example, jam' al-qasr of salah is a rukhsa. So the asl is that you pray the 4 rak'at and you on time. The rukhsa, to alleviate your pain, to alleviate your suffering, we give you a ruling to make your life a little bit easier. We have a lot of those in Islam, right? They're all over. When it comes to doubt in a rukhsa, we always go by the safety, not the certainty. So, for example, wiping over al-khuffain. If you're doubting the time, whether you have enough or you don't, then you don't. Even though the asl may be that you do. Maybe the certainty is that I do. If you're doubting, and because it's a rukhsa, because it's a ruling of alleviation, it's not an asl, it's not an original ruling. If you're unsure, if I don't know, do I have another salah? Or do I not have another salah? What you would do is that you would have another salah, because that's the certainty, that we go by the certainty that you still have one more to pray. But if you're debating whether I do or I don't, then your answer is going to be always don't. You're always going to go to what is safer when it comes to issues of rulings of alleviation. And masih al-khuffain is a ruling of alleviation. So rukhsa. What you should be doing is actually performing a full wudu. So when you have doubt about timing and whether you did 24 hours yet or not, and then you just go by yeah.
So another example, if you're taking the distance as the reason for the qasr and jama, and you're not sure, did I go 70 or 80 kilometers, you assume no.
Yeah, within the madhahib you do. So within each school of jurisprudence, for example, if I'm uncertain whether I made it to 70 or 80, maybe whether for the Hanbalis you have to make it to 85 or around 90. So if I didn't make it that far, but I think I'm close enough to it, then you go with the fact that you didn't. You go with the fact that you didn't. And of course, the ruling itself has a lot of other, so it's actually very easy ruling. But within the madhab, you want to stick to what the madhab is teaching within the issue of jam' al-qasr, then you would always side on the fact that you didn't, because you're taking a rukhsa. Because you're taking a ruling of alleviation, you have to be certain. So the argument for this is that because you're taking a ruling that it is not the original ruling, in order for you to have validity of taking that, you have to be 100% sure that you are allowed to do it. You can't have that this is the most, if you have any doubts that this is not, that you can't use this ruling, even if, you just told me a second ago, Sheikh, that the doubt should not, when it comes to a ruling of alleviation, if you have doubt, then that's what you're going to go by. You can go by the doubt so that your rituals are safe. Another example is, for example, seeing a mirage. So if you're doing tayammum, seeing a mirage, you can't make tayammum until you go make sure that's a mirage and not actual water. You have to go, because even though my certainty is that there's no water around me, and that's most likely, there's doubt. I think I'm most likely going to be a mirage. You have to make sure first, because you're taking a rukhsa. You're taking a ruling of alleviation. And of course, after you establish the first mirage, you don't have to establish the second and third, but you have to go at least for the first one that you or not. And there's a lot of examples within rituals for this. For when you're taking a rukhsa and you're uncertain, you always side by not taking the rukhsa anymore, right? The rukhsas are there, you have to take them, but you have to have certainty when you take them, and any doubt will remove that, remove access to it. And that's an exemption to this rule. So this is a very clear exemption. This is not an extra layer of safety, this is just an exemption to the rule. Doubting Jumu'ah timing, they use this one a lot. So when we doubt the timing for Jumu'ah, we don't know if it's we don't go with it. If you're not sure of the timing, whether at the beginning of it or the end of it, you don't apply to it the same rules that I was applying a second ago in terms of salawat. So you have to be 100% certain of the timing of Jumu'ah. And within the madhab, obviously there are madhab that allow before and allow after, and within their rulings, they're fine. But in general speaking, the timing of Jumu'ah is very important. The purity of clothing and water. In general, the purity of clothing and the water, we always side of safety and not on certainty. So, the example, if an animal urinates in water and it changes, but we're not sure. So we're talking about water that is more than 200 liters, right? More than 200 liters where it does not, where a drop of urine won't change anything. But I know within these 200 liters, a animal urinated into the water, and then something changed about the water. But I'm not sure if it changed because of the impurity itself or because of something else, something that's impure, that could be pure, that doesn't affect it. Then I'm going to side on the side of it being the impurity, right? I'm going to side on, even though I don't have certainty that the impurity caused this. I don't have certainty. This is doubt. This is a very high doubt. Like it's actually almost a wham because I don't. But because this issue of the purity of water, and then we always side on water not being pure if we think it's going to be, and clothing the same way. So, for example, clothing. If you if you know that on your clothing there's some najasa, I don't know exactly where. I have to clean the whole clothing. I can't just clean a part of it and think, no, because I have to side on safety when it comes. So when it comes, these are just exemptions that, Allahu A'lam, came from a general understanding of Islamic law. That rukhsas exist to alleviate. So we have to be 100% sure. There has to be no doubt regarding them at any point. Water, purity of what you're going to use for wudu and drink and cook with, and the clothing that you wear, which is what you're going to use for your ibadah. When it comes to your ibadah, because really water, the purity of water and clothing, really if you look at it, is just to allow you for salah. Right? And I told you even in the previous ones, whenever salah was in the rulings, it becomes a little bit less, the ease becomes difficult. I mean, it becomes very strict right away just to protect the ritual itself. Yes?
Is there a maxim that helps us to determine when to go with like the safety versus... There are some, but again, this piece is what makes a scholar of Islam a scholar. Like these arguments is what makes them scholars, because they will make. I'm simplifying an argument that is usually a couple of pages long in terms of why they thought this was a way, why we're going to exempt this this specific situation for this rule. I'm just putting it as a bullet point on a slide and trying to explain it to you. But that's where it comes from. Like learning Islam and is first of all to learn what everyone agrees upon, how they arrived at these conclusions, and how to understand them. And then when you study Islam and you have all the ulum al-ala, so you understand the Arabic language, you know the Quran in totality, you know ulum al-Quran, you understand the asbab al-nuzul, you understand the different stories behind each of the verses that are there, you've studied the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ in totality, so you understand exactly how that's going to be dealt with. Then you can start actually making these arguments. And these arguments sometimes will be accepted by scholars who are similar to your peers and in the madhab, and sometimes they'll be thrown out, tossed into the garbage. And I can tell you that the majority of these arguments made by scholars are tossed into the garbage. Like what we have was what stood the test of time, really. But no, it's a good question, and that's really what you're asking me is what a scholar does. What the function of a scholar. So, but there are some maxims that will answer your question. Just be patient until the end of the yeah. No, so we don't say that. Like I'm saying it's an exemption, but I'm not saying that now your yaqeen is thrown out and you use a shak. Now, for water, you're just citing on safety. نأخذ بالأحوط. It's not that نزيل يقيننا بالشك, وإنما نأخذ بالأحوط. We take that which is safer. Al-ahwat is a word means safer. من الحيطة, which is safety. Yes. Most of them, yeah. There are some that are not that I didn't put here. There's some that are not that I didn't even put here, just so because I don't want to confuse you. So I just use the ones that the majority of madhab kind of agree to these ones. There are some issues of significance, but I will leave that inshallah ta'ala to next week, and we'll go over a number of generated maxims that were generated by this one. So we'll just, for each of the next of the rest of these fine of universal maxims, each of them will take two lessons inshallah, two lectures. So this is number 2. So next lecture, and then 2 for number 3, 2 for number 4, and number 5, and that will kind of put us at the end of, at the beginning of December. I'll try and wrap this up for you within the first week or second week of December, inshallah ta'ala. So each of these maxims will take only 2 lectures. Some of them will require more than 2 lectures, but I'll summarize it so that it doesn't go beyond that in order for you to benefit, inshallah ta'ala. And with that, again, once Isha is 7:45, we'll end at 9 o'clock sharp, inshallah. Jazakumullah khair.